Hi everyone, and welcome to the seminar for the Centre for Religion in Society. I'm delighted today to welcome Tim Middleton, Dr. Tim Middleton, who's joining us from the University of Oxford to speak about Christology and the temporal trauma of the Anthropocene. Tim's particularly well suited to engage with theology and the sciences, having completed his first PhD in earth sciences, also at the University of Oxford. Now, as a theologian, Tim's research is connected with the Laudato Si Institute, and we're delighted to welcome him today for this hybrid event. Thank you, Tim.
Great. Well, thank you so much, James, and for the very kind invitation. It's really, really good to be with you. So just to say a little bit about where I'm based, which is this thing called the Laudato Si Research Institute in Oxford. It's a project set up by the Jesuits. And Laudato Si, for those of you who might not have come across it, is the document the Pope wrote about climate change back in 2015. So it's an institute that's particularly interested in what we call eco-theology. And I'm aware that this is a somewhat diverse audience, and that my own work is kind of picks and mixes from different disciplines. So I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of background, just to some of the words in the title. So do forgive me if this is familiar to some of you, but I want to try and set the scene and make sure everyone's on board. So to begin with, the Anthropocene, this is a geological epoch that scientists first proposed in the early 2000s, and it translated means the age of humans. And the idea is that we have now entered a new geological epoch, where the trajectory of the whole Earth system is determined by human activities. Things like what we've done to biodiversity, what we've done to the climate, what we've done in putting concrete all over our cities. This is a new epoch that we are now in, and it has scientific verifiability, so you can go and look and see if you can find this marker in the rock record. But the term, the Anthropocene, has also garnered a lot of interest much more widely in the humanities in general and in popular culture. And I think it's because it captures something about how severe our current situation is, our current ecological crisis. It seems to be able to transfer something from the scientific realm into the realm of moral questions. This is something we really need to think about and address. It's also not an unproblematic word. So there have been plenty of critiques of the Anthropocene. One of the most obvious being is that it makes it seem like all of humanity is equally responsible for the mess we're in. It's a species-wide thing, and that's absolutely not the case. Different people in different parts of the world at different times have been much more or much less responsible for our current ecological crisis. So I want to acknowledge that as well. So yeah, so that's the background to the Anthropocene. Then trauma. So what I'm interested in doing in my work is bringing together theologies that look at the natural world, eco-theology, and theologies that deal with trauma. Now, diagnoses of trauma in human beings began in the 70s and 80s, initially with veterans from Vietnam, and then subsequently victims of domestic abuse. And trauma theory has grown up since then, both as a medical diagnosis, but also as a term that's used, again, much more widely in things like literary studies. And then in maybe the last decade or two, theologians have started thinking about trauma and how to wrestle with these new diagnoses. And by trauma, I mean a very specific type of suffering, a suffering that doesn't seem to go away, that persists in some form. So you've probably heard of post-traumatic stress disorder is the most common form in human beings, but it's quite a particular form of suffering that has this kind of longevity to it. And theologians are now wrestling with this as a kind of new way to think about issues of human suffering. And they're interested in not just how you respond pastorally, but also what it might mean for our theologies, whether our theologies need to be rethought in light of what we're finding out about trauma. So in my work, I'm taking some of those ideas about trauma as they pertain to human beings and applying them in a metaphorical sense to what's going on to our planet. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And then just finally, Christology. So by Christology, I just mean the job that systematic theologians do when they think about the person and work of Christ. But I should say at the outset that I'm not a terribly systematic theologian. Plus, I don't think you can do systematic theology very well when you're talking about trauma. Trauma is a phenomenon that inherently means things are disjointed, things are fragmented. It's very hard to produce a kind of big picture synthesis of what we're about here. So I kind of think about picking out motifs from systematic theology rather than offering anything systematic myself. So that's by way of introduction. Okay, so I'm going to segue now into the paper I've got in front of me. I'm hoping to cover these 5 different areas as we go through. And there'll be some pretty pictures. In fact, I should have explained the first pretty picture. The first pretty picture is by a Canadian photographer called Edward Batinsky from a collection which he just calls Anthropocene. And I find it very intriguing because when you first see it, it looks like you might be looking at some sort of fossil. In actual fact, it's a very zoomed out aerial shot of mining activity on a really large scale. So you can kind of see here some kind of mining equipment and vehicles and what have you. And I think it just brings home the extent of human impact on the face of the earth. And I've got a few more of these pictures on the way through, and they're all by this photographer, Edward Batinsky. So, my introduction then. The advent of the Anthropocene as a piece of scientific terminology was always supposed to prompt a rethink. So it was proposed by 2 scientists, Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stomer, and they expressly intended it as a warning to the world. If humanity collectively now exerts a force on the Earth system sufficient to redirect its course entirely, then it seems prudent to pause and reconsider. And there are 2 parts to the word Anthropocene. It says something about humanity, anthropos, and something about time, since the suffix "scene" comes from the Greek for new, kainos. In other words, this new age of humans has both anthropological and temporal implications. For Christian theology, the Anthropocene undoubtedly raises important questions about the human being. What is or should be the place and role of humanity within or alongside the rest of the natural world? Does this idea of the Anthropocene make us more arrogant or more humble? Those are vital questions, but what I actually want to do today is to think about the second part of the word Anthropocene, about its temporal dimensions. What does this new period of geological time mean for theology? And specifically, how might Christians need to reimagine Christ in the light of this latest division of time? Given the many negative consequences associated with the arrival of the Anthropocene, my proposal is that we can talk about it as a kind of temporal trauma, a rupture that permanently divides Earth history into a before and an after. This is because many of the changes in the Earth system that are currently occurring in the Anthropocene are irreversible, at least in the medium to long term. So just as the victims of trauma deal with recurring and persisting symptoms, we too are going to be living in the aftermath of our current ecological catastrophe for the foreseeable future. The imprint that humanity leaves in the fossil record, things like radioactive signatures, the skeletons of our domesticated animals, plastic, concrete, these will be as permanent as the Earth itself. And it's this irreversible aspect of the Anthropocene that motivates my theological rethinking. And specifically, what I want to bring into question are those theological narratives that talk about progress, healing, and even salvation. These might be fatally interrupted by the traumatic intrusion of the Anthropocene. Those Christologies that proceed in a very linear fashion from incarnation to crucifixion to resurrection are unable, I suggest, to accommodate this radical disruption. Instead, what I want to think about is what I'm calling a deep time Christology. And by that, I mean a Christology that doesn't rush too quickly to talking about resurrection and healing, but can acknowledge and bear witness, and that word witness is very, very important for trauma theologians, bear witness to those aspects of the Anthropocene which result in destruction that will persist through planetary history. And it's by focusing particularly, and I'll come to this right at the end, it's by focusing particularly on the scars on Christ's resurrection and ascension body, I suggest, that we find that theological witness to the ongoing trauma of the Anthropocene. Okay, so part 2 then. It's important to say a little bit more about what I mean by the temporal trauma of the Anthropocene. I'm not suggesting here that the Earth is conscious, that it has a subject that's capable of experiencing trauma itself. What I'm doing is just trying to apply some of the thinking of trauma theorists and trauma theologians in a deliberately anthropomorphic way to Earth systems and processes. The point is that there are some striking similarities between what we observe of human trauma and the way in which the Anthropocene is impacting the Earth. So in those cases of human trauma, the symptoms that are to do with time involve things like the fragmentation and failure of memories from the past, the invasion of the present via flashbacks, and an inability to imagine the future. And it's the continuation of these symptoms and consequences beyond the initial event that distinguishes trauma from other types of suffering. For many victims of trauma, symptoms will persist for the rest of their lives, and the trauma theorist Judith Herman refers to this as, quote, the indelible imprint of the traumatic moment, end quote. Here, there's no neat linear timeline of healing. It is simply not the case that time heals all wounds. Instead, the symptoms recur and the wounds persist. And what we have to do is to learn how to live with rather than recover from trauma. And that's true even in cases of post-traumatic healing and growth. The impact still remains in one form or another. Now, my suggestion is that the Anthropocene shows some similarities. So the Anthropocene Working Group, which is the international group of scientists that are tasked with defining the onset of the Anthropocene and its existence in the geological record, they catalogue a whole load of different changes that are occurring in the Earth system. And they write the following, so this is the quote on the screen. Many of these changes will persist for millennia or longer and are altering the trajectory of the Earth system, some with permanent effect. They're being reflected in a distinctive body of geological strata now accumulating, with potential to be preserved into the far future, end quote. So the point about the transformations occurring in the Anthropocene is that they're ongoing and potentially irreversible. One of the reasons why these changes are permanent is because the Earth system includes a series of tipping points. And one example of that would be the Greenland ice sheet. So there are various what we call positive feedback loops that mean once the ice sheet melts, there is no easy going back. It will be lost for good. So it seems to me that the geologists are pretty clear. Just as human trauma persists, these Anthropocene changes will leave another indelible imprint on the Earth. So the ethicist Clive Hamilton doesn't hold back in his assessment of how radically humanity has changed the planet's trajectory. He says, quote, the course of the Earth system has been changed irrevocably, end quote. Our current release of carbon dioxide from deep geological storage will precipitate, he says, another quote, changes that have everlasting consequences, end quote. So, for example, it's already expected that we are going to prevent the next ice age in 50,000 years' time, and probably even the one after that in 130,000 years from now. It's also estimated that if we do nothing else about it, the carbon dioxide we are currently releasing would take hundreds of thousands of years to make it back into geological storage. And the species diversity that's currently entering a sixth mass extinction event, it will take millions of years for species diversity to recover. In terms of human lifespans, these timeframes are almost unimaginable, but they are tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of generations. So even if humanity were to transition to living in some sort of ecological harmony overnight, it would still take millennia for the Earth system to return to the conditions before the Anthropocene. Now, hundreds of thousands, even millions of years is not strictly permanence, but these timeframes, as I say, are far, far bigger than the reference we have for the length of human civilizations, let alone individual human actions. And the signal we leave in the rock record is likely to be as permanent as the Earth itself. The Earth could therefore be said to retain the imprint of our current Anthropocene trauma in markers like the composition of the atmosphere, the remaining biodiversity we are able to see, deep sea sediments, Antarctic ice sheets, and the rock record. It's in these senses, I think, that we could talk about the Earth remembering, again, quote, the indelible imprints of the traumatic moment. Another very good example of how the temporal symptoms of trauma apply in the natural world is provided by one of the trauma theologians, Shelley Rambo. And she writes about Hurricane Katrina. One of the pastors she interviewed for her work recounts to her, and this is another quote, "Life for people in New Orleans follows a new timeline, pre-Katrina and post-Katrina. For those who survived, time has been permanently ruptured, and they will forevermore think about the shape of their lives in terms of this pre-Katrina and post-Katrina." And then the same pastor says, quote, "After the storm is always here." And what Rambo draws out particularly interestingly, I think, is that this temporal trauma does not just apply to human beings, but to the natural world too. So a quote from Rambo: "The streets and the land bear the marks of an overwhelming storm. Long after persons and communities experience trauma, the storm is still there. There's something new in the visible landscape of New Orleans that mirrors the internal processes of persons and communities living on in the aftermath of trauma." End quote. So we have this stark division between the before and the after, and there's this lingering sense that the world has irrevocably changed, and this applies just as much to the landscape as to the people. So Clive Hamilton's argument about the Anthropocene, I think, is very similar to what Rambo says here about Hurricane Katrina, only the Anthropocene is on a much larger scale. There is, he says, quote, "a rupture in Earth history," end quote. And another quote, "We have seen the entire history of the Earth split irrevocably into two halves," end quote. So anyone in the future who looks at the biography of the Earth will be able to divide it into the pre-Anthropocene and the post-Anthropocene on the basis of the major changes that are occurring now. In the post-Anthropocene, life on Earth will always be living with the consequences of the changes brought about in the Anthropocene. And the Earth's record of this Anthropocene trauma will be open, though, to multiple interpretations. It's going to be ambiguous. So on the one hand, if you took a very optimistic view of what humanity is currently doing, you could understand this Anthropocene as some sort of legacy or monument, something that preserves the activity of human beings and a reassuring sign, perhaps, that we have not been entirely forgotten, even if human beings were to become extinct. At the same time, you might want to talk about this record as something like a wound or a scar on the Earth, a permanent imprint of our traumatic violence. Both interpretations are conceivable, but the second, I would suggest, sounds rather humbler than the first. Either way, this monument or scar will serve as a kind of witness, a form of communication to the far future, if there is anyone there to read it, about the planetary scale transformations that are currently occurring. Okay, so I want to move now on to my third section and talk specifically about Christology. So what does the temporal trauma of the Anthropocene mean for Christian thinking about Christ? What does the persistence and potential indelibility of human impacts on the Earth system have to do with how Christian theologians understand the person and work of Christ? So to go again to Shelley Rambo, the trauma theologian I mentioned a minute ago, the result of a trauma such as the Anthropocene is to upend any notions of time as linear or progressive. We tend to think of past, present, and future as advancing and developing. But in the context of trauma, she says, and this is a quote, sorry, this is not the one that's on the screen, but this is another quote from Rambo. She says, "The past event enters into the present in a way that confuses this trajectory of past, present, and future," end quote. In the case of the Anthropocene, this is certainly true. The future fate of the Greenland ice sheet, for example, depends on the cumulative emissions of the past. And Rambo's conclusion is that this disruption of time interrupts what we normally say about Christology, what I mentioned earlier, this progression from incarnation to crucifixion to resurrection. She says that's limited in its ability to speak to those who suffer ongoing trauma. And this could potentially include the earth itself. So the quote that's up on the screen then from Rambo, she says, "A linear reading of cross and resurrection places death and life in a continuum. Death is behind and life is ahead. Life emerges victoriously from death. This way of reading can, at its best, provide a sense of hope and promise for the future. But it can also gloss over the realities of pain and loss, glorify suffering, and justify violence." Now, Rambo says that the desire for a fresh start is absolutely understandable, but she's worried that new beginnings can also be seductive. Victims might be made to feel as if they should pretend that everything's been fixed when their reality is actually very different. So again, for example, the slow melting of an ice sheet doesn't really seem to be recognized by this linear trajectory of healing. Furthermore, the progression from crucifixion to resurrection can be not only unrecognizable to sufferers of trauma, it can actually actively mask the suffering. Those who speak too easily of resurrection are often those who are ignoring suffering. The rhetoric of rebuilding, restoring, recovering, and even resurrecting can become oppressive if these processes aren't resonating with the experience of victims. At its worst, this desire to progress results in a kind of Christian triumphalism. So Rambo says this: "As long as Christian theologians are wedded to a linear reading of salvation history, they'll be unable to address the disruptive temporality in trauma," end quote. So if what you understand by theological redemption is some sort of inevitable improvement, that's the absolute opposite of what's needed, according to Rambo. And there are, in the case of the Anthropocene, people who think about it in these terms. So they might be called something like eco-modernists, and they view the Anthropocene as something to be celebrated and a recognition of humanity's progressive control over the planet. But I think they reenact exactly what Rambo is warning against here, that this is a very human hubris, fed by this kind of Christological triumphalism. So what we need, I think, if Christian theology is to avoid occluding the ongoing suffering of the Anthropocene, is a Christology that's not tied to this idea of progression through time. And there are strategies within Christian claims about Christ that might be able to do this. So several trauma theologians have pointed out that traumatic interruption is already there within scriptures and theologies, especially in the case of Christ. Christ's torture and execution at the crucifixion might be a perfect example of trauma. The abrupt ending of Mark's gospel as the women flee in terror and the disordered thoughts of the disciples on the road to Emmaus look like very typical post-traumatic responses. And given the centrality of the cross for many Christians, some have even suggested that the discipline of Christian theology is as a whole itself a response to trauma. So on these sorts of accounts, dealing with trauma is already part and parcel of what Christian theology is doing, and Christology in particular. It's not hard to see how Christian faith can be said to revolve around the central trauma of the crucifixion. But as well as the crucifixion, there is also a sense in which we can talk about the incarnation as a type of temporal trauma. So when Christ is born, the timeline of the Western world is fractured permanently from BC to AD, there's a transition from before to after that might be a diagnosis of this indelible traumatic moment, something a little bit similar to the Anthropocene. We could say that we are forevermore after Christ, after the Anthropocene, after the storm. So there is a possibility, I think, that Christology, despite Rambo's misgivings, has something to say about what I'm calling the temporal trauma of the Anthropocene, because the incarnation is similarly eruptive. Okay, so in my next section, I want to talk a little bit more about this in relation to the idea of deep time. So Rambo's desire to redirect Christology away from this linear thinking is echoed by another theologian called Niels Gregersen. He's a contemporary Danish theologian. And he's credited with proposing something called deep incarnation theology, which is aiming to think about the person of Christ in the context of wider social, biological, and material processes. And what Gregersen says about time is that we should be rejecting, and this is his word, any chronocentric interpretations of the incarnation. So what he's rejecting here is ideas of chronological time, which kind of progresses forward like how a clock measures time. But if we think about time in this way, he says, from past to present to future, that does not just do justice to those living within alternative time frames, either the kind of circular rhythms of the planet or the ongoing symptoms of trauma. So to put it very succinctly, Gregersen is worried about exactly the same thing that Rambo was worried about, this linear understanding of time and this linear understanding of theological salvation. So Gregersen's proposed solution to this chronocentric interpretation hinges on this word that he uses, deep. For Gregersen, deep incarnation is not only about a deep connection to material reality, but also a deep sense of Christ's connection to time. And he says this: if incarnation is deep in flesh, it is also deep in time, insofar as time, space, and eternity are interwoven, end quote. So if we think about Christ as embedded into the material world, we also need to think about Christ on much, much longer time scans than his 33 years of life. This would allow us to think about Christology in a way that's less tied to this linear progression through history, and therefore more relevant to this idea of the extended temporality of the Anthropocene. And when Gregersen's using this word deep, he's picking up here on a much more widely used concept of deep time, which first arose with a Scottish geologist called James Hutton. And what Hutton realized back in the 18th century was that timescales many orders of magnitude larger than had previously been assumed are necessary to explain the various geological observations he was making. And there's a famous quote from the end of his book. He says, "We must come to appreciate time with no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end." And this idea of deep time has been taken up in the environmental movement in general to draw attention to some of those very, very long-term impacts I was mentioning at the beginning, to make us think about how long what we're doing now is going to last for on the planet. So Gregersen is aware of this kind of geological idea of deep time and is wanting to bring it into Christology when he talks about deep incarnation. The challenge for the deep incarnation theologians is to rethink Christology in the context of deep time. And if we can get a handle on this, that is an understanding of Christ that doesn't rely on this linear progression, but remains for the very long term with victims of trauma who continue to suffer, then I think we can start to talk about a Christology that is able to engage with the trauma of the Anthropocene. And there are two parts of what Gregersen talks about in his deep incarnation that I do think point towards these longer time frames. So one thing he does is to talk about the genealogies of Christ, which root Christ in a much deeper human history. They kind of connect human families and ancestral ties to deep time itself. But this is a bit of a double-edged sword with respect to geological time. They extend time as far beyond the lifespan of Jesus, but they don't necessarily extend the time span to that of the age of the earth. These lineages do not, as literalist readers might once have assumed, connect Christ to the beginning of the world. What they can do is to embed Christ within evolutionary development of life on Earth, which is itself embedded within the geological timeframes I've been talking about. The genealogies of Christ point at least to the depth of human history, if not the depth of planetary time. So that's supposed to be kind of illustrated there by the genealogies picture you see on the left. The other aspect of this deep incarnation thinking focuses on the word logos and logos Christologies. So in the beginning of John's Gospel, the word logos is not only equated with Christ, but also plays a part in creation. The logos is present throughout creation, before and presumably after the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth. So in this way, the logos can expand our temporal horizons. Christ is somehow relevant to the whole created order before and presumably after the existence of the human species. However, theologians who follow this view ultimately hold that the Logos, Christ, the second person of the Trinity, is eternal. And eternity is actually quite different to the deep time that I'm talking about here. The temporal trauma of the Anthropocene is likely to persist on planetary timescales, but it's not, strictly speaking, eternal. It'll only last for as long as the Earth itself survives. So when I talk about something like a deep time Christology, I'm not seeking to pass comment on the eternal side of the equation, but rather to try and prompt us to think about the time span involved on the temporal side. So talking about Logos Christologies, again, I think that is only partially helpful for enlarging the Christological field of view. So if on the one hand, the genealogies of Christ don't quite get us far enough because they're stuck within human history, then I think Logos Christology might go too far by leaping straight to eternity. So there remain questions about how a deep time Christology could be envisaged. Although the Christic genealogies and Logos Christologies do provide some connections to the deep past, they're also not very clear on what Christ has to say about the deep future. How specifically could Christology avoid those linear trajectories of salvation that Shelley Rambo was warning about? And most importantly, for my purposes here, what has Christ got to do with the indelible imprint that results from the trauma of the Anthropocene? So here's what I promised earlier, a discussion around the scars on Christ's body. The questions that I was just asking about deep time Christology, I don't think are very easy to answer. A lot of what people write about Christ is very, very human-centered, and not much thinking has been gone into the potential relevance of Christ for the long-term future of the Earth, especially a long-term future that might not involve humanity. But there is, I suggest, a helpful motif that we can pursue. And that's this idea of the scars on Christ's resurrection and ascension body. And my proposal is that these scars on Christ's body bear witness, and again, it's that important word, witness, for trauma theologians, bear witness to the permanence of traumatic wounding that occurs to our planet, to the indelible imprint of the Anthropocene scar. So Shelley Rambo says, in relation to this idea of witnessing, quote, "The concept of witness, as forged through trauma literatures, offers a way of thinking about a relationship to and responsibility for the past in its ongoingness." So let me just say a little bit more by way of finishing up about this idea of these permanent scars. We know Christ's body is a wounded body, At the crucifixion, nails are hammered into his hands and feet, and his sides pierced by a spear. Scripture attests to the persistence of these wounds in the resurrection body too. In Luke's gospel, we hear about Christ urging the disciples to look at my hands and my feet, he says. And in John's gospel, he showed them his hands and his side. And then the most famous example of all is the story of doubting Thomas, where Thomas demands to put his finger in the marks of the nails and his hand in his side. But not only are we talking about scars on a resurrection body, there's also a prominent strand within Christianity that maintains the wounds on Christ's ascension body. And this is because there would be an insincerity about Christ's incarnation and crucifixion if all these scars were suddenly to be wiped away once Christ had ascended. There are, it must be admitted, some theologians in the course of Christian history who have denied these continuing wounds or scars. John Calvin, for example, claimed that the resurrection wounds were only temporary, just to convince the disciples that it was really Christ. For Calvin, it would have been distinctly preferable if Thomas could have believed on the basis of word alone, rather than requiring material evidence. The wounds are just an accommodation to human weakness. But Shelley Rambo says of Calvin's position, this is a quote, the resurrected body cannot carry the marks forward because the vision of heaven that Calvin presents requires a glorious body unmarked by human limitation, end quote. But we cannot, with Calvin, dismiss Christ's wounds as a temporary confirmation of identity, because this, I think, fails to acknowledge the permanence of traumatic wounding. Instead, the resurrection and ascension wounds persist into deep time as continuing witnesses to the trauma of the crucifixion. So earlier on, I was explaining how this geological idea of the Anthropocene could be talked about as a permanent scar on the body of the Earth, a witness to the traumatic violence that we're inflicting on the planet. And Stephen Scrimshire says the following, quote, "Our impacts upon the Earth have a moral weight that cannot be forgotten, either with the promise of mortal erasure or with the promise of reconciliation or healing. The Anthropocene as a scar has the power to deepen a sense of genuine loss, grief, and wonder at the impact of human actions upon the Earth, by opening up a vastly wider temporal imagination." This idea of the Earth as wounded is a very visceral image, but what I find especially striking is that we could say exactly the same of Christ in relation to the wounds on the resurrection and ascension body. So kind of paraphrasing and rewording that same quotation. The impact of the crucifixion on Christ has a moral weight that cannot be forgotten with the promise of the resurrection. Christ's scarred body has the power to deepen a sense of genuine loss, grief, and wonder by opening up a vastly wider temporal imagination. So given this parallel, we might be able to say something like, Christ serves as a witness to the permanence of the Anthropocene scar in deep time. When we look at Christ's wounded resurrection and ascension body, we are reminded of the indelible imprint of the traumatic violence that we are currently inflicting. Whatever transformation and redemption Christ brings, the trauma of the crucifixion is never undone. In the same way, whatever improvements we make in our treatment of the planet, we have already left a permanent marker in the rock record that will never be removed. It might be appealing to think, like Calvin does about Christ's ascension body, that the wounds on our planet will ultimately disappear. But I think that's to capitulate to the view that redemption entails erasure of the past. And Scrimshire goes on, as he puts it, the witness, this is the witness of either Christ's wounded body or the wounded body of the earth, quote, refuses the sense of an erasure of memory that would be implied in the wiping away of all materially embodied past wrongs. Rather, the intention is that something of the lamentable element of humanity's exacerbation of ecological decay and extinction is insisted upon. Scrimshire also emphasizes the impact that these scarred witnesses, both Christ and the earth, can have on our own behavior. So in the previous quotation, he was saying, they have the power to deepen a sense of genuine loss, grief, and wonder, and to extend our temporal imagination. So in the case of Christ, and this is a point that Shelley Rambo makes, Thomas's confrontation with Christ's wounds demands from him an assessment of his own complicity in the wounding. Anyone encountering Christ's permanently wounded body has cause to reflect on their own involvement in acts of violence and the timescales for which those impacts will last. And I think this vision brings greater significance to events in the present. Christ's witness becomes a resource for our ethical thinking in the present. And the same is true, I suggest, of the scars on the earth. Once we recognize their persistence in deep time, we are called to assess our own part in the wounding. So this is another of Batinsky's images, and I think deforestation is a very visceral example of the scarring that occurs to the surface of the earth. In actual fact, this isn't nearly so permanent as some of the other things that are going on. The regrowth of trees is much easier to think about than those other impacts that will last for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. But if you want a picture of a scarred earth, I think that's quite a helpful one. So to conclude then, here in a theology of Christ's resurrection and ascension wounds, what I've wanted to suggest is that we find a Christological motif, not a complete systematic understanding, just a motif that can shed some light on what I've been describing as the temporal trauma of the Anthropocene. The indelible imprint of the crucifixion on Christ's body mirrors and witnesses the indelible imprint of the Anthropocene on the body of the earth. And this just might be what's needed in a Christology that wrestles with traumatic symptoms that persist deep into the planetary future. Christ's permanently scarred body bears witness to our permanently scarred earth. Thank you so much for bearing with me and listening. That's it.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was such an interesting and fascinating talk, a new way of looking at Christology for so many people, I'm sure. We're lucky to have enough time for questions now, and just a quick note for the sake of the hybrid audience. If you have a question and you are watching online, then please do type your question into the Q&A. I'll be here, I'll be able to read out the questions. And for the sake of audio, any questions that come from within the room, we'll also repeat in order to make sure that everyone can hear it. So with that, if questions are coming in, do put your hand up. But I suppose I will abuse my role as chair and ask the first question. Tim, I was fascinated to hear you talk at the end about in the language of vocation, in the language of understanding the doctrine of the incarnation in terms of call. And I was wondering if the resources that Christology provides theologians with might well be understood in those terms of call, but perhaps in a very urgent way, a way in which we understand a call to action in the manner of climate activists and so on. So I was wondering if you could say more about that theologically, and also whether you could tell us about any organizations that do Christian organizations or theologically minded organizations that understand call and response in that particular way through the lens of activism.
Yeah, that's a good question, and one I've been wrestling with for a little while, because trauma theologians are a little bit hesitant to make that step, to kind of prescribe an ethical action that must follow, because that's a little bit like moving too soon to the resurrection or moving too soon to the healing. Their primary concern is this idea of bearing witness, of bringing to light the suffering that has occurred, and letting people know about it, in the hopes that people will hear about it and it will prevent future violence. But what the priority is the victim, and just listening to them. So in this particular case, the victim, if you like, I guess, is the earth itself. Our priority should be to listen to that. So when I say there's there's kind of a call on us as modeled by Christ, I think I would want to limit that to saying Christ bears witness to that, what's going on. The call on us is to simply bear witness to what's going on. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't want ethical actions to follow from that further down the line. But within the kind of parameters of what a trauma theologian does, it would stop at the witnessing. And I think in some ways that's how you can understand what a climate scientist does. In bringing to light information about what's going on, that is a form of witnessing to what's occurring. To answer your other question about like which organizations you could go to, like there are plenty of places. So there's something called Operation Noah, there's Arosha, another charity. They run a program for churches called Eco Church, which is about getting church buildings to think about this. There's a whole load of things in the Catholic Church that have come off the back of Laudato Si. So there's something called the Laudato Si movement. So there is thankfully a growing number of Christian organizations doing very, very practical things in response to this. But I'm a little bit hesitant to say that, kind of what I'm talking about here can get you that far, because of the hesitancy of the trauma theologians focus on the victim.
Great, thank you very much. We already have one question coming in virtually from one attendee, which I'll read out now. Tim, how would you counter the danger of unimaginable timescales making people feel insignificant and thus more likely to pursue individualist salvation?
Yeah, that's another very good question. And the kind of environmental and ecological thinkers that are pushing this idea of deep time are walking exactly that tightrope. And there is the risk that it becomes almost misanthropic. You look at what would be good for the planet in the deep future, and actually what would be good for the planet in the deep future would be without human beings, maybe. Like there's some very dangerous conclusions that you can draw from this deep time thinking. There are quite a few popular projects that have tried to draw people's attention to this thinking in deep time. So one that people might have come across is called the Clock of the Long Now, which is funded by Jeff Bezos, and he's trying to build a massive clock in a desert in Texas that's going to keep time for the next 10,000 years. And I can already tell from people's reactions in the room that there might be some problems with that, right? So on the one hand, he's doing what people say is a good thing, which is drawing our attention to the long-term future, and that we need to be thinking on those timescales. On the other hand, it's a massively arrogant thing to be doing that's just kind of asserting his own importance in the world, right? So yeah, we do have to be very, very wary of all of those dangers about kind of deep time thinking. I still want to claim it's valuable to some extent. I think people in general are not typically aware of how long it might take, for example, for species diversity to recover from the current mass extinction event. So I think a little bit of prompting about how what we're doing now over the time span of a few years, a few decades, will have implications for millions of years. I think that almost just as a shock tactic is worth doing. But yeah, I would completely understand the kind of other reservations about taking the deep time thinking too.
Question over there.
Yeah, Tim, just wanted to thank you for a lovely talk. Just wanted to build on this discussion around time. There's something that would be lovely to clarify in my mind, which connects deep time with your critique of linear time. So I'm not quite sure whether your advocacy of deep time is your version of a no, we need to go non-linear in time. Obviously, deep time can also be linear, or whether you'd advocate a more sort of Augustinian space-time non-linearity. Obviously, the scars are always there for any viewer outside of time, or even Chris Tilling's recent, re-articulation. I've seen this in the St. Andrews volume of circular time by looping Revelation Genesis. So there are many versions of non-linear time, and is deep time one of them?
So just for the benefit of those listening online, I'll repeat the question. It's a question about clarifying the various alternatives between deep time, linear time, and possibly other alternatives that weren't meant to install, such as circular time as theological alternatives.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's another major problem with most of the deep time thinking, is that it is just an extension of this linear time. I mean, and that's one of the problems with Jeff Bezos's block, right? It's still modelled on this idea of linear human progress that needs to be very much questioned. So yes, my hope is that in drawing attention to deep time, it can be something other than this linear trajectory of progress. One of the other ideas that I've been playing with that I didn't mention is the idea in Irenaeus' theology of recapitulation. So what Christ is doing is recapitulating what went wrong with humanity, and in that very idea there is a circular element, right? It's going back and repeating, going back and bearing witness to coming. Yeah, so I quite like that as a place to go to think about it. Yeah, as you say, a slightly more circular form or repetitive form of time, which seems to match very, very nicely with the idea that trauma symptoms persist and return and recur, and Christ is able to kind of loop back round and acknowledge that in Irenaeus' thinking. I don't know Chris Tilling's stuff, so I should probably ask you about that, because that sounds very interesting and helpful on this end.
Sharon?
So, how do you integrate eschatology then, which might suggest there's a big bang somewhere at the end and you have a new earth? And so does that put some Christians off delving into this in that way, because they're actually expecting it all to end anyway, and sometimes thinking it's going to be quite soon?
So a question on where eschatology fits into these notions of time.
That's a really good question, and it's what I'm hoping to do next when I finish my PhD, is how does any of this fit with eschatology? I can give you my kind of brief thoughts so far. I think within talk about eschatology, we need to move away from the idea that it's tied up with the temporal future and the end of time. I think there are other ways of talking about eschatology that aren't so much about the future, but about, so people talk about an inaugurated eschatology, so it's already been begun in Christ, and it's already kind of breaking into the present all the time. And it's not just about some sort of future apocalypse, it's about something that's already kind of happens at each moment of time, or even is nothing to do with time whatsoever. So I quite like the work of Catherine Tanner, who talks about a detemporalized eschatology. So what she means is that our idea, or the Christian idea of, say, the kingdom of God, a kingdom is a spatial category, not a temporal category. And it's nothing to do with the future, it's to do with the pattern of relationships to each other and to God, and that's possible at any moment in time. So yeah, my initial thinking is that it would actually be very hard to square what people have written about eschatology of the future with this discussion of deep time. So I think maybe eschatology might be nothing to do with the future. Maybe.
Yeah, question, I think.
It was in connection with the question of time. So you have a proposal for this chronology with deep time concept. So it brought to my mind the opposition between critical opposition between chronos, so the quantitative time, and kairos, which is the qualitative time. Actually, the same root of Aristotle. So I don't know to what extent these reflections on deep time relate to the kairos thing.
So a question here on what is the relationship of deep time to the kairos theory? Am I saying that?
Kairos.
Kairos, yeah.
Yeah, I think exactly that. This is exactly the kind of previous two questions, that deep time risks being part of chronos, right? It risks being just this extension of chronological time into the future. And what we really need is some way of incorporating what's going to happen to the planet in the long-term future into this kairos way of thinking, into where what we're aiming for, the kind of eschatological goal, can break in a kind of kairotic fashion, rather than just being about kind of some end. So I think you're exactly right. I think kairos is more helpful than chronos. How that pans out, I haven't quite got straight.
There was no mention to kairos, and I was thinking, okay, I don't know to what extent the parallel between deep time and kairos is exact, or there is a crucial difference in the approach.
I think they ought to be brought together. I don't quite know how to do it. So yeah, yeah.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and there is one more coming in online. Came in a while ago. Sorry, Mark. This is quite a long question. Wording about the Anthropocene starting, strictly speaking, in terms of how do we define the start of the Anthropocene? And this question culminates with the following. So, have humans been traumatic for the planet from the very start? If so, how does that interplay with a theological assertion of God regarding all creation after the humans evolved that was very good?
Okay. Yeah, in terms of when the Anthropocene begins, I believe the scientific consensus is slowly kind of converging on something like 1945. So there are ideas about so-called early Anthropocene hypotheses, which is basically that humans have always had an impact on the planet ever since we first started doing agriculture. So we've always been in the Anthropocene. It's nothing terribly new. I must admit, so Clive Hamilton, who I mentioned, has quite a strong view on this, and I find him persuasive, which is that, sure, we've always had an impact on the environment, but locally, and it's only quite recently that we've changed the course of the Earth system as a whole. And if you want a good time marker for that, 1945 is quite good because it's the time of the first nuclear test, so there's a very clear signature that you're going to find all over the world to mark this shift to where we now are redirecting the whole Earth system. We're stopping ice ages, we're warming the planet by 3 or 4 degrees. I think there is something of a different order about that compared to the impact agriculture had on the landscape in early human times. So I do think the trauma, as I'm talking about it, is a recent phenomenon and can't be pinned on all of human history. How that fits with the idea of creation as good is a tricky one. I mean, I think based on what I'm saying, you would be able to talk about the creation prior to 1945 as good, and we brought in a lot of the problems. We're not the only problem, though. There are problems of kind of natural evil and what have you. And one of the things I do wrestle with is how to square that, the idea of creation as good. And I don't have a particularly easy or helpful answer to that particular conundrum, I'm afraid. But in terms of what we're getting wrong in the Anthropocene, I do think that's a reason.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for everyone's questions, and a special thank you to those who joined for this hybrid seminar virtually. I think everyone will join me in thanking Tim for an interesting talk.